guys. So yesterday marks 8 years since the Grenfell Tower fire. I mean, it's crazy to think it's been that long since the fire happened. I mean, it feels like it was only yesterday. I remember obviously it was a school day. It was a Wednesday, and my nana phoned us and she said, "Was have you seen the news?" And we were like, she said, "Have you seen about that big tower block fire in West London?" And we were like, "No, we haven't seen that." So we put the news on, and we saw obviously the block had gone up. And as obviously they were showing footage of the fire, and I was like, my first thoughts on the Grenfell Tower fire were, how the hell had that building gone up in flames like that? How the fire spread up the building as quickly as it did? I mean, obviously, it's fair to say that there's never been a fire that's worse than Grenfell. Um, thankfully, in the years since that happened, we've not seen, a repeat of something like that or something that was, quite as bad, as the Grenfell Tower fire. I always think, it's always so tough to think about the people who lost their lives that night. Obviously, 72 people killed in that fire. Obviously, you kind of partly blame the London Fire Brigade because they were obviously advising people to stay in their flats and not try to make any attempts to leave or to get out themselves, wait to be rescued, which is obviously what a lot of people did. A lot of people listened to that advice and stayed in their flats and obviously didn't try and make any attempts to get out if they could. Um, I mean, I don't know if that's really the sort of advice that you should be giving in that situation. I don't think I would be advising people to stay in their flats and wait to be rescued. And I can't help but think that that may have contributed to the large number of fatalities that there were in the Grenfell Tower disaster, obviously in the Grenfell Tower tragedy, obviously, the fact that 72 people died, maybe, the advice from the London Fire Brigade advising people to stay in their flats and wait to be rescued was perhaps a contributing factor in the large number of fatalities there were that night. It's crazy to think about the fact that people would have been, going about their daily business as usual earlier on in the day, blissfully unaware of the tragedy that was about to unfold in the early hours of the morning. Like they weren't, that they would have had no reason to believe that they were going to be woken up in the early hours of the morning being told to get the hell out of their flats because the building was on fire. You think about those kids that were killed in the fire, they went to school. They went to school that day, um, and are blissfully unaware, of the fact that they weren't going to be going to school again the next day. They weren't going to be, that was like the last ever time they were going to see all of their friends and see all of their teachers at school. They were never going to see them again. It's awful to think about what people went through that night. Like every time I go back and see, like I see clips of the Grenfell Tower fire, it's so haunting. Knowing that how scared people must have been that night. Like I can't begin to imagine what must have been going through people's minds that night. You know, like they must have been going so much, going through their minds, the panic, how scared they must have been, especially those people that didn't get out alive, knowing that they were probably about to die. It must have been so scary for them and for the kids as well that sadly perished in the fire. It must have been very, very scary, scary situation for them, in their final moments. It's sad to think that, whole families were lost in that Grenfell Tower fire. So many families destroyed. So many people had their lives, turned upside down by that fire. And so many people have had to rebuild their lives following that tragedy. I imagine that a lot of people haunted by the fact that they got out of the building alive. When so many of the people, so many people that they knew and had known for years didn't get out alive. They didn't make it. It must have been, so surreal for them knowing that, they obviously they would have talked to those people probably every day. They would have seen those people, all the time, and it must be so hard for them knowing that those people, so many of those people didn't get out of the building alive. They didn't make it at the end of the day. Although they did, although some people made it out. They made it out alive. So many of the people they knew didn't. So many people that they knew would have seen and probably spoken to every day didn't. Weren't so lucky or weren't so fortunate. Um, and there was a lot of crazy stories I heard around Grenfell. There was that story of a woman throwing her baby out of the tower and someone actually caught the baby. I don't know if that's true. Um, Apparently she was shouting, my baby, I need to save my baby." And she threw the baby and someone caught it. Now, I don't know if that's actually true. There was also a story, I think, that came out the day, and I swear to God I remember this. So there was a story that came out that a baby had been found alive in Grenfell Tower in the following morning after the fire. Like, that was quite crazy. I was like, how has a baby been found alive in the tower after that fire? Like, it's impossible. We all knew that. I think that story was totally bullshit. Anyway, when you think about that fire, you think obviously the people that were on like the lower floors, it wouldn't have been too bad for them because it would have been easier for them to get out of the building, quite quickly. But those on the upper floors, sort of 20th floor above, wouldn't have stood a chance. There was no way they were going to get out that building. Because they couldn't get down, they weren't going to be able to get down all the way down the stairs. Because the stairs were pitch black and full of thick black smoke. If they had been trying to get down the stairs, they would have collapsed. They would have been overcome by that smoke. There was no way those people that were on the top of that were on the higher floors. There was no way they were going to get out that building alive. That was impossible. For them, it was impossible for them to do that. At least those people on the lower floors, it was, for them that were on the lower floors, it was easier for them to actually get out, but they didn't have so many, flights of stairs to get down. So it wouldn't have been too bad for them. But you think about, those on higher floors and how many flights they had to get down, obviously, flights of stairs they had to get down, with the stairs being pitch black and covered in thick black smoke, it would have been awful. As I think people did actually collapse on the stairs. People were trying to get down the stairs and they actually collapsed on the stairs because they were overcome by the thick black, like they were overcome by the smoke. There's one couple I did feel really sorry for. They lost their baby boy Logan. He was stillborn. Unfortunately, I think he was killed by the effects of the smoke from the fire. Which is really really quite sad. It's sad to think about those children that died that night. You see the videos from people who were outside the building and they were watching, like they were filming the build, and you could hear the kids in the videos screaming like help, help. And you could hear someone in the video saying, "Oh my God, they're screaming!" Like, it must have been so horrible for those people that were, out like seeing all of the people screaming for help, flashing their lights, um, and there was nothing they could do. It obviously wouldn't have been, it would have been, too dangerous for them to try and go back into the building and try and help to get those people out. They would have put themselves, in serious danger by doing that. That all they could do was hope, was watch and hope that they got those people out of the building. You know, I remember watching a video that was filmed by one of the residents that lived in there. You hear someone saying, hello, we're stuck on the 21st floor. There's too many people stuck upstairs. Seeing videos like that, you see videos like that, it's just really haunting. And it's just awful to think about the fact that so many people lost their lives, in the fire that night. And at the end of the day, nothing will ever take that pain away. Nothing will ever make up for what for what those people lost that night. Nothing will ever make up for the innocent lives that were lost that night. You know, no one will, nothing will ever make up for the fact that people, that people's lives were turned upside down. That night. People are always gonna be haunted by that forever. It's hard to think about what as I said, it must be so difficult, so tough for those people that got out of the building and you know knowing that so many of the people that they knew and probably seen and spoken to every day didn't get out of the building alive. I can't imagine how hard that must be for them, knowing that whilst they were lucky, so many people they knew once that there were so many people that they knew weren't the ones so lucky. You know,
Oh,
I mean, I can't imagine how difficult that, how painful that must be. For those people knowing that they're never going to see that, see or speak to those people again. It must be really, really horrible for them.
that where I've left.
And I was probably putting it mildly, to say the very least. That it's probably, it was probably very difficult for them, and it wasn't easy for them. I think that's probably putting it, mildly, I would say. But I mean, it's just unbelievable what happened, and those people that lost their lives will never ever be forgotten. They will be remembered. They will always be remembered. I think the 14th of June will always be a painful reminder of the lives that were lost that night and of the tragedy that unfolded that night and the horrors that the horror that unfolded. You know, as I said, I always, whenever I look at how quickly that fight, whenever I think back to that, I remember my first thought being, how did that fire spread up the building so quickly? Like, I was shocked by that. I was so shocked by. That's the thing that I remember was like I remember I was so shocked by the fact that the fire had spread up the building as quickly as it did. Like you don't always, you never expect to see that. Like you never expect to see a fire spread up a building as quickly as that one did. It's like it spread up that it got it spread up that building and all around that building so quick. You know, um, like as I said, it's just crazy to think about those people. About the fact that all of those people that lived in that tower, earlier on in the day would have been going about their daily business, doing what they were doing. All of those kids would have been in school, as usual. That during the day, blissfully unaware of the tragic events that were about to happen in the early hours of the morning. Blissfully unaware that they were going to die. They would have had no reason to believe that they were going to die, but unfortunately, they did. You know, it's just like I can't begin to really imagine how scary it must have been for people that night. And yet, you know, I mean, I'm glad that a lot of people did get out alive. I'm glad that a lot of people did survive that terrible night. But there's no, it's always so sad to think about the fact that 72 people tragically died. And as I said, I think the advice that that was given by the fire brigade was a contributing factor to that. I think that a lot of people had obviously listened to the advice that was given by the fire brigade and had chosen to, and had obviously decided to stay in their flats and wait to be rescued, because obviously that was the advice that was given by the London Fire Brigade obviously was for people to stay in their flats and wait to be rescued, and I just think that that probably wasn't the sort of advice that they should have been given. They should have been giving people, and I think that that was partly to blame for the fact that over 70 people, the fact that 72 people died. No, I think that had that, I hate to say it, but and part of me feels that had the police not given people that advice, maybe more people would have survived. Maybe maybe the number of fatalities would have been far less than it actually was. When I look back at it, when I think about the Grenfell, it's one thing that's always played on my mind a little bit. Um, there's part of me that doubts that it was a fire that started in by a fish freezer. I feel like there's part of me that's wondered if there's part of me that's always wondered if there was like more to the story than it just being a fire that started in a fridge freezer. But I don't think it was. I think I've always kind of felt like there was more to the story than it being just a fire that started in a fridge freezer in a full floor flat. I feel like there's more to it than that. That there's more to it that we don't really know. Um, you know, I mean, you also think about how poorly designed the state, the Ramfell was. Obviously, there was only like one staircase to get out of the building. You know, absolutely ridiculous. In a building like that, you would think a building like that would have more than one staircase, more or less. I think most flats do have. Lots of flats do have more than one staircase. You know, um, I think that things like that Ramfell Tower fire is always, it's one of those things that makes me fear living like living really high up in a tower block because you're thinking like if there is a fire, how are you gonna get out when you're so high up? It needs to be on. I mean, if you're in a lot of flats but you're not too high up, it's not so bad. You can get out fairly quickly. But if you're right high up, it's like how would you get out? Like you you basically would be screwed. You're not gonna get out of that building. That was the case. Obviously, that night, obviously with the Grenfell fire, obviously all of those people that were in the floors that were quite higher up, you know, they didn't stand a chance. I think there was a couple of people from like the upper sort of from the top floors that did actually manage to get out, but not many. Um, I think that the Gomez family, that the family I mentioned who, the couple I mentioned who lost their little baby boy Logan. I think they lived in one of the top floors, and they managed to get out. But I think the family that lived next door to them or lived across from them, they didn't get out alive. I think it was the El Wahhabi family that lived opposite or lived next door to them, and they didn't get out of the building alive. Um, and as I said, that that's the thing that I think people will always be haunted by is the fact that people they got out of the building alive, but so many people that they knew, who they would have seen every day and probably would have spoken to every day, didn't get out of the building alive. They'll always be haunted by that. Um, I imagine that people are still living with those fears and are still living with those anxieties after the fire, and you know I mean, is it really impossible to say that people are still rebuilding their lives after that, after what happened? But as I said, no amount of justice will ever really make up for the pain that was caused that night and for the pain that people have suffered, as a result of the events of that night. No amount of justice will ever make up for the lives that were lost that night. No amount of justice is going to bring those people back. None of those no amount of justice is going to change what happened. You know, that's the reality of the situation. Is that no amount of justice is ever going to take that pain away. It has to be said. So I thought I'm going to do another video, honouring those that lost their lives in Grenfell. Obviously, mate, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I'll see you for another one soon. Bye bye.